In this episode, I'm once again joined by Tibetologist, author, and Tantric Buddhist Lama, Glenn Mullin. We learn how a mystical vision at Tibet's Oracle Lake, Lhamo Latso, directed Glenn to move to Mongolia for 10 years, where he would eventually receive the nation's highest honour, the Mongolian Star. We discuss Glenn's encounters and friendships with the great shamans of the steppes, Himalayan Oracles, and the last Princess of Mongolia. Glenn reveals the inner workings of Mongolian Shamanism, including the training of apprentices, 99 spirit channeling, ritual and trance practices, and more. So without further ado, Lama Glenn Mullin. Glenn Mullin, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Honor and pleasure to be here.
We've talked about many things on the episodes that you've been a guest on this podcast, but something we haven't talked much about is your time spent in Mongolia. You spent 10 years in Mongolia on the steppes and in the Gobi, and became acquainted, it seems, with many of the Mongolian shamans there, including the former state shaman, Byampadorj. I'm curious, what brought you to Mongolia in the first place? Why did you stay so long? And can you talk a bit about how you formed the relationships with those shamans there?
Basically, the sequence of events was that after my training in Dharamsala between 72 and 1984, and for the next, 7-8 years, I would go back to India for about 6 months of the year, whenever Dalai Lama would give teachings, to do retreats and motorcycling in the Himalayas. And then I moved back to North America for a while because of some projects I was involved with, founding a thing called Mystical Arts of Tibet to bring over Tibetan Lamas and tour cities in North America, and with sacred music, sacred dance, making sound mandalas. Originally forming that in Canada, then giving it to a friend who wanted to continue that work down in Atlanta. And so I was sort of based in North America, but as a writer and a meditation teacher, I was still traveling 5, 6, 7 months a year, every year. And it came to the point where I thought, I would love to move back to Asia and just sort of live in that sort of gentle Asian atmosphere. And kind of the sweetness of a traditional Buddhist society, if you will, a certain kind of emotional interaction between humanoids, which we don't really have over here in North America. You may have something a little bit like that in the more stable societies in Europe, but North America is really a sort of a boiling too fast soup of hodgepodge of all kinds of influence. So I really wanted to move back, but I wasn't sure where I could move back to, because I didn't want to move back to India, to Dharamsala, because the refugee situation and visa situation, all of that was not so good. When I did live there as Commonwealthers, we were allowed to stay without any visas. We had a 99-year treaty with India, but the Sikhs who murdered Mrs. Gandhi were sponsored by Sikhs, Indians living in Canada. So that India asked us to send back those guys, but of course they were all Canadian citizens, and we can't pick someone up and deport them to a country without due diligence, presentation of evidence. All of the evidence from the Indian government basically was gained by illegal spying in Canada on Canadians. So they didn't want. So as a result, going back to India wasn't really a big option. And previously, I had visa problems with India, so I didn't want to, after this event with the murder of Mrs. Gandhi, I had some visa issues. I didn't want to go back. Nepal would have been my next choice, really, because I love Nepal and love motorcycling in Nepal. And they've got, of their 18 kingdoms that are united as the country of Nepal, about 6 of 7 of those are traditionally Buddhist societies and Tibetan Buddhists. And there's lots of Tibetan Lamas and Tibetan refugees. So keeping my Tibetan language up to par would have been quite easy there. But unfortunately, at that time, the Maoists in China were having a very heavy activity up in the mountains. And so the place was turned into a little bit of a killing fields. No Westerners were hurt in it, but it meant living there became a little bit more stressful. Up in the Maoists were mostly creating pandemonium in the remote places, but of course that pushed many of the villagers out of the city and flooding into Kathmandu Valley. So I decided that wouldn't be so good. Of course, my first choice would be in Tibet, but with Tibet under Chinese occupation, that's not going to happen. I might have been able to get into West China, one of the East Tibetan regions, which aren't under the Tibet Autonomous Region classification, but there they speak a kind of a pidgin Tibetan, if I could say. Amdo was probably where I like the best, but their Tibetan is, unless one of the Tibetans there has lived and gone to school in central Tibet, it's like a different language. Kampa, not so bad. But again, it would have been very problematic with the government getting visas. So I went to the Oracle Lake in Tibet. And that's where they go to look for Dalai Lamas. And every Tibetan traditionally used to try and go there once or twice in their life for a kind of a life epiphany vision. It's a little bit like a crystal ball experience. I'm not an expert on crystal balls. I remember when I was in my early 20s out on the West Coast, a lot of little shops sold crystal balls. And they're kind of these smoky, cloudy things. And when you look into them, it's like you kind of drift, they're kind of hypnotic. You kind of drift off into visual kaleidoscopic experiences. They sort of draw you in and, I don't know, just tickle your imagination or something like that. Except with the Oracle Lake, you walk up to about 17,600 feet and you look down to a tiny little lake that, you know, looks about this size or something like that. Doesn't look big or tall because it's, you know, a quarter of a mile away or something like that. And it's surrounded by a ring of mountains. And you're at 16,000 feet looking down into it, and it becomes almost like a crystal ball. Hey, we used to buy those things as paperweights over here, and if you're, you know, doing your studies or whatever, you get a little bored for a while, you'll turn it on and just look into it like, sort of a paperweight, multitasking paperweight, you could say. Before the days of like internet on your telephones, or before the days of hand phones, before the days of internet. And so I decided to go there. And actually a British American filmmaker who lives in England made a documentary about that trip to Tibet. It's called Sacred Sites of the Dalai Lamas, something like that. And he later, Michael Weissy, he later published a book of some photographs taken by some of our team members. We didn't talk about my story of looking for a hint for what to do, where in Asia to move back. But when I went there, everyone had their own sort of personal experience, you could say. But there were 21 of us, and I think 18 of them had very, very strong, you could say, visionary experiences. From my side, after looking into the lake for about 15, 20 minutes, you kind of, and you're at, don't forget, 17,600 feet. The lake is surrounded by mountains. So these are all reflected in the lake, coming and going in a kind of a misty way. Then clouds in the sky makes a further kind of layer of bewitching and betwixting aspect to the lake gazing experience. And birds flying, and then a little wind will come up and make ripples and waves. So all of this makes a multi-layered kind of visual stimuli. And amazingly, one after another, it's almost like you fall asleep sitting up, but your eyes are wide open and you're looking into the lake. And you just kind of have these dream-like experiences, where what you see is a little bit like a picture postcard, but with no GPS setting. And I remember, when I was doing work on my book on the 14 Dalai Lamas and how they find each of the Dalai Lamas, they look in the lake, and often the one looking will get those kind of picture postcard experience, and will describe, yes, I saw this kind of stupa and a house with this kind of roof, and over above there was this kind of shaped little temple. And that'll go back to the Central Commission for how you identify when you finally get down to candidates. Does anyone born in a place having those kind of buildings, kind of thing? That lay of the land. So in my case, I saw very specific kind of things. And sometimes you see mantric letters in many of the literature about that lake. And for me, many of the strong element of my experience was Bodhisattva Manjushri. So I had a feeling that I was seeing 5 mountains at one point, looking very kind of craggy or something like that. If craggy is an authentic word in the English language. If not, please, Webster and Oxford, enter it immediately. And so I kept seeing this thing of 5 mountains kept coming through. And then little things to do with Manjushri, like the syllable D kept kind of floating up. And, you're in a timeless state. After half an hour of sitting at 17,600 feet, looking into this sort of very hypnotic kind of crystal ball lake, your head really just starts swimming, and you enter a kind of a place that's halfway between sleep and wakefulness. And it's like a dream, but a lucid dream, something like that. And it's just a series of visuals. And so that's what occurred to me. And I thought, well, that's maybe some sort of hint. So then I thought, oh, the 5, maybe that refers to Utaishan, the sacred 5 mountains in North China, which are Buddhist mountains in the very north, under what used to be old Mongolia. And these days it's south of the Great Wall, the White Wall. So it's actually Inner Mongolia by the Manchu Mongol classification after the Manchus invaded and conquered China. But it's sort of a Mongolian set of mountains in the far south of Mongolia, by the old way of looking at Mongolia in our present political maps. And so I thought, oh, maybe it's there. So then I went and visited some months later, maybe the next spring, I think it was, next summer. I went to Mongolia. I went to the 5 Peak Mountain, thinking, oh, maybe I'll see something. And now it might have been possible for me to get some kind of permission from the Chinese government to live there, because it's a non-political place. It's far enough from the Tibetan border that I wouldn't come into the have to deal with the administrative offices of those people in charge of ruling Tibet, or places not presently under Tibet Autonomous Region, but which are historically Tibetan areas. So I thought maybe it's there. And I spent a couple of weeks there, but nothing really linked. And so I thought, oh, I don't know. And then when I was there, I was invited. There's part of, I tied, usually with my visits like that, I would often tie them into bigger teaching tours. So I'd sort of tied it into an ASIN teaching tour, and I had an invitation from Mongolia to go up and teach for a month in Mongolia in some of the newly established Buddhist centers after the fall of communism in Mongolia. So I went up to Mongolia, and sort of one after another, the half dozen visuals that have popped up in the lake popped up. And I was thinking to myself, well, this might be a nice place. It was really to make my base. And then I went around, and it turned out that one of the lamas who had become one of the main lamas in the country, Gundu Zampo, had actually lived in Dharamsala and gone to the same monastic school, although not at the same time as me in Dharamsala. But I'd met him in Dharamsala in I guess it would be early 80s or mid 80s, something like that. And so then I went and visited him, and his Tibetan had become really perfect, and whenever Dalai Lama would visit Mongolia in those days, he would serve as Dalai Lama's translator. And we really hit it off. And then the head Lama at the same time, the Lama who had become the sort of administrative head of all new monks in Mongolia, so-called Gen and Humble Lama. I also had met him briefly in Dharamsala. And so then when I went to visit him, I said, yeah, I'm not sure what I want to do. Basing in North America is a bit of a headache, and I do travel and teach 6-7 months a year, and I'm looking for a new base. So I'm thinking of maybe Mongolia. And he says, well, if you do, you should try and make it 10 or 12 years, because just coming once or twice, it's hard to do much benefit. But if you come every year for 10, 12 years, then that'll help. And in my mind, I usually think in 12-year increments. It's kind of probably a thing coming over from the way car licenses and the car insurance goes. Like up to age 12, you can't drive. After that, different countries, you can drive on little roads, back roads on the farm, that sort of thing. And once you turn 24, your insurance is very big until you're 24. Once you're 24, it goes way down. And once you're 36, things change again. And once you're 48, your whole body changes. And once you're 60, the government will pay you just to keep breathing. And just to keep breathing and shopping to keep the national economy running. Keep doctors in gainful employ. So I had been thinking, 10, 12 years anyway. And so then I looked around, and right when I was there, that first year, I made friends. So I found that many of the monks I had met over in Dharamsala over the years were there, and now had, with the fall of communism, had actually become reasonably influential. And so I spoke to them about it. And then I became friends with a woman who was kind of the last princess. Her grandmother had been the last princess in 1924 when the communists had taken over and the use of titles such as princess was banned. So she was her descendant. And we became very good friends, and she was in charge of the visa situation, long-term visas. And I became friends with her because I started doing a project with the National Museum, Zanabazar Museum, that's known as in honor of, or the National Museum in honor of Zanabazar. Zanabazar was sort of the first Lama king of Mongolia, sort of like the Dalai Lama. Zanabazar is a mispronunciation of Shnanavajra, the Sanskrit Shnanavajra, which is a translation of his Tibetan name, Yeshe Dorje. So he had been a contemporary of the fifth Dalai Lama and a co-student with the fifth Dalai Lama of the first or fourth, depending on counting systems of Panchen Lama, Panchen Losang Chugi Gyaltsen. And then later, when Mongolia sort of became unified following a series of civil wars, he emerged as kind of the most popular Lama in the country, much like the fifth Dalai Lama had in Tibet in 1642. In the 1680s, he became the first Lama, so Lama king. So it's kind of the most Buddhistic, the museum in Mongolia with the most great Buddhist art. And the Rubin Museum in New York had asked if I would speak to the director about documenting some of their stuff, so if it gets stolen, at least there's a record of it. Like a lot of it wasn't even photographed. And so I became friends with the national director, and he introduced me to the princess. They were very good friends, and then it turned out she was more or less in charge of foreign long-term visas. And she was also in charge of protocol at the airport. So then once we became friends, basically whenever I came, she would have people walk on the plane and walk me off like a VIP and take me to the VIP lounge and serve me free, good quality Mongolian vodka. But anyway, so I said to her, well, I'd like to base myself here, but once a year visas are too much of a headache, and these short visas, so I would need a 3-year visa. And she said, well, there's no such visa actually legally at the moment, but we can look into what can be done. They said, so we do have a kind of a visa like that called a service visa that used to be given to Soviet bloc countries and can still be given. That was never taken off the books, although it's not used since the fall of the Soviet Union. But we could try and get you in under that, but you're not a Soviet bloc country. I said, well, what you should do is get me in under that, and then that will serve as a precedent, and any other Canadian ever coming to Mongolia can similarly get that service visa. They can just say, well, that Buddhist writer Glenn Mullin got it, so he was a Canadian, I'm a Canadian, you should give it to me. And so she stuck her neck out and gave it to me. And the only side was it was not really a fully legal visa in the sense that I wasn't a Soviet bloc country. It was legal in that it was given by the international or the foreign secretary, the foreign secretary house. But that went on for 3 years. And then after 3 years, she hadn't managed to convince the government to include Canadians in that category. So she said, we'll have to give you a different 3-year visa this time. We'll call it a meditational advisor visa. So my next 3-year visa was as meditational advisor. And each of them had its own faults. With the first type, you can only be in the country for 90 days. But then you can go out for a day and come back. So in that I travel and teach so much. In the 3 years I had it, only at one occasion was it inconvenient. And then I just hopped on a train up to Russia, spent a week up in Lake Baikal and Ulan-Ude and visiting the Mongol Buddhist sites up there. And my real purpose was I wanted a place where I could rent an apartment at a reasonable price and have a fairly relaxed life and use as a writing retreat place, because traveling, teaching 5-6 months a year, wherever I sort of bunker down, I want to be able to get writing done. So that was one of the main reasons. And I wanted it to be a place where I can keep my spoken Tibetan alive, and without someone to talk to. That's not probable. That's not very easy. And so it worked out very, very nicely. And so basically I spent 9 years there like that, 3 or 4 months a year, some years, 5 months, but keeping an apartment that whole time. And when I wasn't in town, my Mongolian friends would be very happy because they could use my apartment. So there was a lot at that time, new apartments being built and old ones being taken down, and a lot of people moving from the countryside into the city, living in gear, yurts on the outside. So my apartment was never empty when I was away. So it was kind of a win-win situation for me and for others. And I did quite a few books when I was up there. I did my book with Tom Kelly on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I did the Sacred Sites of the Dalai Lama's book. I wrote that when I was up there. I think a female Buddha's book I did, Flying Mystics of Tibetan Buddhism. Maybe Buddha in Paradise. I think I also did that. Anyway, I did 5 or 6 books during that 9 years. And that was from about 2003 until 2003 or 4 until 2011 or 12. Yeah. Or maybe 12 or 13. Yeah, so that period. Yeah, so it was after a lot of the things in the 90s, I mostly spent between the States and Canada and doing international teaching tours. And so at the end of that is when I wanted to move back. So then when I was up there, during communist times, both Buddhism and shamanism were equally kind of oppressed, you could say, by the communists. And Buddhism was more easy to oppress because they're dependent upon some sort of collective institutional situation. It's kind of enlightenment factory processing units, you could say, monasteries, meditation hermitage, kshetras and retreats and these kind of places. So it's easy kind of to destroy all of that, the educational side of Buddhism. And when you destroy the educational side, because Buddhism is normally, traditionally, Tibetan Buddhism, a 12 to a 15-year education to become a qualified Lama. So once you destroy those facilities, and of course, they also banned tulkus, and tulkus have played a big role in the whole preservation of a living Enlightenment tradition. So that perhaps was more easy to attack. Shamanism was stamped out, and if they would have to have you turned in. Someone would have to declare you a shaman, like Europe during the witch hunts, perhaps. And because of a lot of shamanic transmission happens just in a direct training system, grandfather to grandson, or just some shaman who takes 2 or 3 students. And it often happens in remote areas. A lot of it, they love doing things on mountains. And the training period is much shorter, 2 or 3 years like that. It's learning to drum well and do the various kinds of rituals well, and then how to induce trances. Tibetans will call it lapaba, channeling. They talk about the 99 tingir, the 99 cosmological forces. We could say extraterrestrial UFO spirits, but cosmological spirits, and often appearing in ancestral form. And so the more of those 99 one can channel, the higher degree of shaman one is. And beginning shamans learn to channel 1 or 2 or 3, and then they get up to 10. And sort of the best shamans get up to 70, 75, 80, something like that. And so then if one needs any kind of service, any kind of reading, you could say, one goes to them for whatever reason. And it's much like in the sort of spiritual energy side of life that we see, say, in Africa, in sort of the white voodoo side of things. The Christians, of course, speak of voodoo like it's something evil, but because Christ isn't listed there as one of the people who's involved, and none of the voodoo priests are circumcised, so that's kind of like a strike, 2 strikes against them right from the beginning. But it's a little bit like that, or it's our pre-Christian European tradition of white magic. Many of the shamans are also healers. I mean, most people go to them for disease, healing, life problems. They're also a little bit like psychologists and counselors, but they don't do it through a degree from learning to talk Jungian or Adler or Freudian speak, but rather through a channeling of kind of spiritual energy. And I had, so I didn't know any of the shaman side of Mongolia before visiting Mongolia, but once I was there, I began meeting them. And from North America, of course, our own native North Americans all come from that part of the world. And Western anthropologists say in 3 waves, 25 BC, 13 BC, and 8,000 BC. 13,000 BC, 25,000, and 8,000 BC, and they came across in 3 waves. So if one has much connection with North American native culture, any of that native culture which hasn't been destroyed or perverted with sort of forced Christianity, if you will, one will see many, many similar elements. It's very ancient tradition of healing and energy work. And yeah, and most of these people are really fabulous, fabulous people. I mean, the communist governments tried to put them off as like charlatans and people trying to cheat the public. And, if you have a problem in your life, go ask a government expert and they'll straighten it out for you. Don't ask a shaman. That was a communist, so that could be a communist slogan. Don't ask a shaman. And so I became friends with a number of them. And the first, actually, a former shaman to the president, Byampadorj, I met him by accident. I was on a tour pilgrimage with some people, some friends. And I used to bring once or twice a year a group after my Tibet trips. I would bring small groups of 10, 15, 20 people to Mongolia to visit the old Buddhist places. So we were on one of those tours, and one of my members had cracked a bone walking on a sacred mountain. And his foot was in a cast and all of that. A really wonderful, wonderful doctor from Texas. And we were staying at it. But when he had it, he said, "Now, Glenn, I want to tell you, you're not allowed to send me back to Ulaanbaatar. I'm continuing on this tour, and that's that. So you got to figure a way where you can get me into my wheelchair and on and off the bus and into the bathroom and back. I can wipe my own ass." And so he was traveling with us, and one of the camps we were staying in, Byampadorj just happened to be there with some of his family and some of his students. And he, so the Princess Shore, my princess friend, I would often take her along on the tours for a number of reasons. One is she was just very wonderful with any little problem that came up. Like, for instance, we're in Seitserleg at one time and the police stopped our van and found a headlight out or something like that. And it's very typical after communism fell in Mongolia, the director of the National Museum, now cost of living has gone up to say $400 or $500 a month for a family, but his salary is still just $125 a month. Or the police, cost of living is $200 or $300, say, a month for a small family like that. And his salary is maybe $75 a month. And so a lot of these people are all looking for, at that time, a little extra, what do you call it? Cash flows. And so I would try in the summer when I brought people over, if any television people came to do a project or movie people came to do a movie, or writers, journalists, to, find them some gainful employ over the summer months when they have a lot of time off. So I would always take her along in case of problems. And we come into Seitserleg and the police stop and say, "Oh no, we're going to have to confiscate your van, blah, 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 blah." And so if we would have just been by ourselves, it would have been a day or two of negotiating for how much to get our van back. But she gets off and speaks in very wonderful Mongolian. I mean, very, in charge of airport protocol for the visits of Prince Charles, George W. Bush, and so forth, kind of Mongolian, really high Mongolian. "Oh, yes, oh, I know, officer, I know you're right. And yeah, it is our fault. We didn't see it, I'm sure, please. If you wish, we can make a call to the president of the country and ask him to have you give us sort of special leniency because of our guests are very honored guests," and blah, blah. "Oh, okay." No need to phone the president. But anyway, so then we're at one of those ger camps. They call them ger camps in Mongolia, a ger being a Mongolian kind of yurt, where the yurts are like tea cozies. A yurt to Mongolians are the teepee shapes. And they're up in the north, and the outside is always made of leather on a yurt. And the ger is the steppes and the gobi, where they don't have trees, so they don't make like that. And a sort of tea cozy made out of wool and cotton and felt. Anyway, so she comes running in. "Oh, Lama Clan, the president's shaman's here." he's in town. Well, you should come and meet him. He's such a wonderful guy. We've been friends for years. Whenever he comes and goes from the country, as president shaman and myself, my role is in charge of protocol at the airport. I'd always be asked to process his papers quickly and blah, 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 blah. So I went over and met him, and he was like this absolutely sweet guy. And, probably 70 years old or something like that, quite tall, like maybe 6'2" or 6'3", and very bulky. I mean, looking a little bit like not as thick as a sumo wrestler, but he would certainly pass for a well-embodied being. And really, really lovely, very, very humble. And I said to him, yeah, well, let's see, what have we got going? Yeah, we do have this one fellow who's like broken a bone in his leg, in his ankle. And be nice if you take a look at it and do something about it. He says, okay. So we bring him over. He puts on his shaman costume with the hat and the feathers and all of the wolf's tail and the wolf's foot. Very, very striking. Whenever he goes into trance, he puts that on. It's kind of to honor the shamanic tradition. When they're not in trance, they're quite ordinary people. Some of them are doctors and some of them are school teachers. And they can be anything they like to be in their non-trance form. But when they go into trance, it's like they're a whole different person. It's a little bit like with Tibetan oracles, when in the same way, for instance, I was quite good friends in Dharamsala with the main female oracle, Dorje Yudronma, the turquoise light oracle. And when she would go into trance, she would be completely off of this planet. She would be like dancing on another world system altogether and just speaking in verse at 100 miles an hour, in perfect timed metered verse at 100 miles an hour without a pause. But when she was not in trance, she would be like this. When she come out of trance, she never even remembered a single thing that had happened when she was in trance.
Wow.
So the shamans of Mongolia, a little bit like that, although they may have some of them may have some recollection of what happened between those two sets. But most of them have a kind of dual life, you could say, when they're, and I don't know if it was always like that, but under, communism and post-communism, under communism, you had to have some niche, which was your profession. Could be artist, could be singer, could be musician. You just had to go to the appropriate school and get a piece of paper saying that that's what you did, and you'd put in your blood, sweat, and tears to get that piece of paper. And now for the rest of your life, you got a salary to be a singer or a painter or a poet, school teacher, doctor, whatever it was. The good side of communism was that kind of stability, that when it worked well, it was a very effective, socially stable, and quite happy, healthy life for people. The downside was government authority made any government decision uncontested. So if you ever went against the government, you lost all privileges of being a citizen, and therefore you were kind of an outcast, and they could do anything with you they wanted. So that's obviously the downside. But under the new shamanism, under communism from 1924, you could say, really from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, if anyone had any shamanic involvement, they had to be very careful about it. And from 1990, after the fall of communism, well, even 1980s, although communism was still officially there, it had sort of become more of a, just an economic system rather than a social and legal system. So during the 80s, there was pretty big relaxation. But with the fall of communism, it was like everything was on the table. So Byampadorj became one of the great revivers of the tradition, you could say. He started officially accepting disciples or students, and always had 200 or 300 of them from throughout the 90s, and from the time I met him. I probably met him in, I don't know, 2007 or 8 or something like 6, 7, 8. And then I met 3 or 4 other shamans on various occasions, because once the shamans learned that there was a foreigner who liked shamanism, they would often come to visit me and, have a glass of vodka, invite me to their ceremonies and so on. And of course, for YouTube, I'm sure I think I sent you the link. I made a short video on the Shaman Festival, which is held every April in Mongolia. And probably 20 or 30 shaman teachers have their own little area. And they all come with anywhere from 10 to a couple of hundred of their students. And for 3 days, do drumming and singing 24 hours a day without let. So they go. Part of the trance, I think, in those big festivals comes from a combination of the intensity of drumming for 3 days and also the intensity of sleep deprivation while singing and dancing in the cold. But you can find it on YouTube. I think if you search my name, Glenn Mullin, and Mongolian Festival or something like that.
I will put that link to that in the description.
Sure. But anyway, so then I became more involved with them. And after that, if there were shaman conferences held, and from time to time, academics of the world would hold a little conference on shamanism. And I never became an expert on shamanism, but if it was held in Mongolia by Mongolians, they like to call it an international conference. So they want the more international people that can get there, the better it is, kind of for how it looks on television and for the record. So I was invited to, 4 or 5 of those, maybe half a dozen of those, and just to read a small paper, present a small paper. I'd usually do it on something like the similarities between Tantric Buddhism and traditional shamanism, and some of the symbolisms or the use of color in ceremonies, and even some of the overlays. Because wherever Buddhism went, it basically would absorb and recast what it found there. And it would become a part of the Buddhist tradition. So I think the strength of Buddhism, for instance, when I went to China, became very Chinesey. I mean, Zen Buddhism is basically Taoism with a foundational philosophy, the philosophical foundations and ethical moral code, you could say, and some of the borrowed linguistic of the Prajnaparamita, the Diamond Sutra, Heart Sutra, and so forth. And the same in Korea, or the same in wherever it's gone. Buddhism has never attempted to displace whatever meritorious culture it encountered, but rather to absorb and recast, if you will, in a kind of a positive light. In other words, if it were to go to New Guinea and they have headhunting, where they still have active headhunting, and you would want to, if those headhunters wanted to become Buddhist, they'd have to make a few minor adjustments, like stop cutting off human heads and shrinking them and hanging them on your tent. But you can do that symbolically and talk about the symbolic side of that. I think we see that in some of the Indian traditions. Human sacrifice was popular in ancient India, especially in the Kali tradition. Anyone building a bridge or a house would like to have someone who is sacrificed in the foundations, and their Kali therefore would stay and take good care of you. So when Buddhism was taken up by those people, they could still use the beneficial sides of those kind of traditions, but no more, catching stray humans in the marketplace and sacrificing them and burying them in the foundations of your bridge. And I think also in Buddhist Tantra, because of shamanism, as we can tell from, when the Hopi came over 13,000 years ago or whatever it was, they brought over many of the symbols of shamanism and the colors of shamanism. So we can see how it predates Buddha by thousands and thousands of years. So there's two sides of it, we could say. What was incorporated by Buddha into the Buddhist Tantras. And then when Buddhism goes to other countries, like for instance, Jewish people taking up Buddhism. And the Jews who take up Buddhism, they call themselves Jubus. Even though they became Buddhist, they will continue to have circumcision amongst their male offspring. So like that sort of thing. Buddhism, if they become Buddhism, we may limit how much can be cut off. But there would still be some bending to accommodate those idiosyncrasies.
That's fascinating. Did you yourself ever engage in any channeling of the Mongolian or Tibetan variety?
No. It's a kind of a specific training. In the Tibetan world, not just anyone does it. It's kind of a calling, you could say. For instance, I lived next door to the old Nechung monastery, not where it presently is in Ganki, but down below. When I had a house on Gamru Road, as it was called, I used to belong to someone called Ta Lama. That's a Mongolian title. And after he died, his house was a rental. And I managed to get that house. And it actually is a Tibetan aristocrat carries that Mongolian title, Talam. And right next to them was a house that had been rented by Nechung Monastery. So I knew the old oracle quite well. And then he died. And then for a while, there was no oracle. But after a couple of years, one of the young monks in Nechung just started falling into trance during the Dorje Trukden, that deity's invocation. Now, for me, I'm not so interested, because that's a calling. I never felt the calling to do it. I much more prefer the route of the Lama teacher than of the ritualist shamanist. Mm-hmm. But I have had many, Buddhist oracles, if it's male, they say Lapaba, female Lapama. I've had many of them do seances for me in the same way, say, Dalai Lama will have the state oracle do, or any other oracle, or anyone can. You basically ask them and make a request and commission. Now, one of them was with Dorje Yudronma in Dharamsala, a great female, and her lineage was mother-daughter transmission. So it had passed for many centuries in that way, mother-daughter. And I guess my strongest memory is on one occasion in Dharamsala, an Irishman had gone up the mountain behind Dharamsala to Trion. And at Trion, you can continue up above and come down the other side, and you're in a whole different valley. You can go north, or you can go turn right, turn left, and there's a whole valley that goes hundreds of miles. So he may have gone over and just gone right or left, never came back. Nobody knew where he was. But he was with a traveling companion. And after 5 days of him not coming back, that traveling companion went down to the police and reported him missing. And then it's like this total panic goes out amongst the police, and the army comes out with thousands of soldiers running up and down and looking, and helicopters and all the rest. And then the police came to us foreigners who were living in Dharamsala and asked to join the search. And I thought, firstly, 5 days is a long time. And secondly, the guy went up wearing short pants, a t-shirt, and flip-flops. So if he doesn't come back, it's a little bit like Darwinism in action. It's kind of like, I'm not sure that this kind of behavior really requires 2,000 or 3,000 people spending days and days looking. And if he's either already dead or he's gone. And so my running up around this mountain is not really going to be anything. I've never been a kind of follow the herd kind of guy. So I went to the Oracle, Dorje Yudronma, turquoise light. And she went into trance. And so I said, is he alive or is he dead? And, she goes into trance and she would chant just at breakneck speed in poetry. And so anyway, the answer is no, he died. He went up, he came down the same day that he went up. And he was a little confused and dizzy because it started to rain and then he got wet. And then he was wearing not really much clothes and it got misty and smoky and he mistook you come to a lot of little forks in the path, and like Robert Frost says, when you come, so who's that, the baseball player? When you come to a fork in the road, take it. Well, he took the wrong one. Yogi Berra, that's it. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. So he took it. And anyway, she said he went along and he tripped over something and fell over the side. And he broke his ankle in a couple of places, broke a couple of ribs and broke his jaw. And he's now lying on the mountainside. And she jumps into a position to kind of indicate the way he looked. He's lying in the mountainside like this. And I guess that's how he landed when he landed down. And she said he stayed away, he stayed alive during that evening. But it rained and up there it hailed and he got very cold. And the next morning, many people walked above him on the path, just above where he had fallen. And he tried to call out to them, but because his jaw was broken and he was so weak from the cold, he couldn't make enough sound and he died that afternoon. So this was, I think, on a Monday. And I said, well, in that case, if he's dead, can you give any kind of direction to where he is? And she said, the problem is in the mountains, one tree looks much like another. And so no matter how I describe it, nobody's going to be able to get there. But don't worry, they'll be bringing him to town on Friday between noon and sunset. This was like on a Monday, or I think it was Monday or Tuesday, but anyway, on Friday. So Friday, myself and 2 or 3 other people went up to town and we sat in a little cafe overlooking the central square in McLeod, which doubles as a bus stop. And about 3:30, these 2 skinny little policemen came walking down with a skeleton and just placed it down at the top of the bus stop while they waited for an ambulance to come and pick it up. And they phoned down and waited for them. And so we all walked over and looked at it. And the position that body was in was identical to the position she had made. And he had the broken ankle, a couple of broken ribs, and the broken jawbone, just as she had said. The other thing she said, anyway, his bones have been picked clean by the vultures. Now, I think the way his body was actually found was that lots of these mountain shepherds knew exactly where it was. But because they had noticed the vultures, right? Because vultures hang around the body like that for several days, taking a little snack here and a little snack there. But they were afraid to get involved because if they said that they knew where it was, maybe the police would, suspect them or look, because if a foreigner dies in India, then there's a big inquisition into the whole thing to be sure that he wasn't murdered. But because back in the old days of British rule, one of the ways of getting even at the overlords was to murder one of them. And so often a case remains open until someone is arrested and convicted. And so I think the shepherds were probably, Up there, they don't call them shepherds, they call them gati, a certain kind of guy who lives at the high altitudes. Even in the middle of winter, they run around with just a jacket down to the middle of their thighs. So they don't wear like pants or knee pads or anything. They just wear like a super warm jacket on the upper part of their body down to the middle of their, roughly to their knees. And then they wear a pair of shoes made from water buffalo hide, which is very, very strong. And usually they buy used tires and put that at the bottom of those running up. They found that those buffalo hide shoes last a lot longer with a little bit of a Japanese tire underneath. But anyway, so just like that oracle had said, it was brought down exactly at that amount of time. A friend of mine in England, actually, Michael Parrott, who lives over in the Oxford area, he was living up on the hill at the time, and he had actually was there when this body was its placement was announced, and so he had gone out with another person living way, way up, a place called Dharmkot at the time. So people did retreats up there, and Dharmkot and Dharamsala is kind of in layers. Down at like 2,000 feet, you've got the Indian government office as the head of Kangra district kind of thing. And then there's Dharamsala proper, which is you've got all the marketing bits. And up is MacLeod Ganj, and that's where you've got like the Tibetan refugee village, and the Dalai Lama's home was not too far from there, given to him by the Indian government. And up above there, another 1,000 feet is where Ling Rinpoche lived and taught, and many of his disciples did retreat. And up at Dharmkot and further up is where people did longer term retreats. And up above there for the 10, 15 miles back into the mountains was where the guys went to do their, 3, 6, 12-year retreats. So anyway, Michael was up there doing a retreat at that time. So he was, I think, involved in the first viewing of the body once the Guddies let it spread the word that they knew where it was. But they wanted, I think they were very slow on that because they really wanted to stay out of it. They were really hoping that the army would just find it there and leave it at that. Because otherwise, chances of one of them being accused of like robbing and murdering the person or interrogated for that or whatever. It was what they were, not that the police would have done that, but just their fear that that would be a consequence. Yeah, so then when I went to Mongolia with shamans, I started attending some of their seances. And they gave, the shaman gave me the head shaman of the country gave me a sort of one of the national honors, which is the Star of Mongolia. So if you get it from the president, it's sort of politically prestigious, but if you get it from head shaman, it's kind of like spiritually prestigious. So that was very gracious of him to do that. And it's sort of the highest honor given in the country. It's sort of like getting the Congressional Medal of Honor in the States, except without the politics involved. That was very, very sweet of him. And I had many other shaman friends, and I would sometimes attend their events. When Richard Gere came to Mongolia, and he's written forwards to 2 or 3 of my books, and I've known him for many, many years. So when he came and he asked me to take him around to some of the things in Ulaanbaatar, one of his days off. And so one of the things he said, oh, when I'm here, I'd really love to experience a shaman channeling. So I asked my 2 favorites, a presidential shaman and also the other is my other one who's really a really very, very powerful shaman. But with shamans, unfortunately, they have days of the week which are inauspicious for them to channel. And so both of them, that was like an off day. Oh, no, not possible. Not absolutely. No, absolutely. No, it's an off day. Sorry, I can bring one of my students for whom it's an on day, and I'll bring a very good student who's very qualified. And so he brought over 2 of his other students. I mean, he came and sat and sort of supervised it. But there's many of the shaman events. Some of them have once or twice a week when they do kind of open sessions, and anyone can come to those sessions. Now, shamans like to do it in a gear. Traditionally, they have a yurt if they're down on the plains, or they'll have a teepee. They'll have a gear if they're on the flatlands or the steppes or the gobi. If they're up in the forest, they'll have a yurt, a teepee. So traditionally, they keep those even in the city, and they'll do those sessions in their yurt or in their gear. And people will come in and sit down, and they'll do it from, say, 6 in the morning till 11 or something like that. And everyone comes in, and one by one, you just move around the circle and come in front, and you ask your question. With Byampadorj, because he channels about, 80 or 90 different ones, when the question's asked, he immediately just leans back like this, and his body goes totally limp. And then he sits up, and it's like a completely different being. So sometimes, for instance, it'll come in the form of a grandmother ancestor. And so then it'll want to drink milk and have milk offered. And sometimes it'll come in the form of a grandfather. Then it'll want a pipe to smoke and some vodka. So he'll light a pipe and have a little sip of vodka. And whatever questions are asked will be, and sometimes it'll recommend very particular little things being done. And very often, of course, this incorporates the burning of various fragrances, if you will, herbs. These are probably medicinal in nature, and the person goes in the pot and you put it under, and the person breathes it in like this for 2 or 3 minutes. It's a kind of a, what do you call it, inside secret, what goes into each of those concoctions. But in my case, for instance, once I took a French friend to one of those, and he was suffering from a really strong kind of depression, anxiety for a few years, partly because of the kind of business he was in was very strained, and also some medical sort of conditions he had. It was very amazing, because when we went in, Byampadorj just sort of slumps, and then he wakes up, and then he sits up, and he's got this kind of whole different kind of physical presence. And he starts talking about his condition and hits everything right on. And then he takes out one of his pouches of powder in his little pot and drops in a couple of pieces of coal and puts it under him and says, yeah, breathe some of this for a couple of minutes. And while he's inhaling it and breathing it, Byampadorj is chanting and beating his drum and so on and so forth. Their drums look very much like our North American native drums. They're kind of big and round like this, only this thick, skin on just one side, and the back side has a handle inside. And so they often sing and dance holding like that. Anyway, my friend came out of it, and I would say for at least a year after that, he was much more cheerful. I mean, of course, once he got back to work and these mega deal, acquisitions, situations, and the whole stress of $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and him getting the credit or the blame for whatever went right and wrong, respectively, sort of brought him down a little bit. But his health definitely improved. His state of mind, his whole feeling became much, much better for well over a year.
Did Byampadorj work with your Texan friend's foot?
Oh, yes. So that was very wonderful. So Byampadorj, he went and spoke about the foot, and he goes, so anyway, right. Yeah, so he basically did about a 10-minute ritual on it, and a kind of you could call it kind of therapeutic touch, where from a distance, he just kind of out and throw energy to it like this. But of course, the whole thing's in a cast and all the rest of it. So when we were in, because after we came down the hill, the first thing I said, when he said he wanted to stay with me, I said, well, the first thing we're doing is going to town and getting a cast put on it, because if it is a cracked bone, we don't want it going anywhere, moving anywhere. And we went to town, and they had a very nice doctor, and they had an x-ray machine. So they x-rayed it and caught the bone was cracked, but not displaced. We call it a hairline fracture, but it's actually a total break, but it hasn't moved anywhere. So got it all wrapped up and put in a nice cast, and traveled for about a week or 10 days, maybe, something like that. And then when we got back to Ulaanbaatar, we went into, they have an SOS, which is like an international system there. We went into their place, and we had them take it off, cut it off, re-x-ray it, and put on a fresh one for traveling back to the States. And, there they put in some other kind of strengthener so that walking through airports and stuff like that, it wouldn't, no damage would come. The only problem he had was back in the States later. So everything was going well, but back in the States, the doctors insisted on opening and putting a pin in it. And his body didn't react well to that pin. He would have been perfect if he would have stuck with what was done in Mongolia and just left it there. But the States are always very nervous if the bone moves for any reason. And so they put a pin in it, and I never would have put a pin in mine, that's for sure. I'd take it upon myself to not let that bone move. You keep it in a cast and you stay off the damn thing, and keep it up a little bit and stuff like that. But he had a pin put in it. That pin became a problem and required a second to be taken out, and some became infected with somehow when they put it in. They didn't get it sterile. So our operation in Mongolia for $75 and a $25 tip to the doctor, because he's working at $100 a month, was absolutely perfect. And the one in UB for maybe $200 at a kind of a more modern hospital, but no better quality, was also excellently done. Had he just stuck with that, he never would have had a problem. But, trouble is in America in particular. If they don't do something and anything goes wrong, you can sue them for millions. So the insurance companies insist that the medical profession insists that this get done. These things are done to avoid the possibility of a humongous medical lawsuit. And it's unfortunate because that reaches over to everything in America. The over testing and over treatment of everything really is, I think, the biggest health damager in America. But anyway, that's a different issue. Yeah, so his Byampadorj's thing was very wonderful because, he even went riding on a camel with his leg like that. Put him up on a camel. Now, Glenn, I know I'm not supposed to, but, I'm not going to be back. And I'm a little bit of an old guy. I'm not going to be back in this part of the world. And if I don't do it today, it doesn't get done for the rest of my life. And that's just a plain, simple fact. And so I know doctors would say, don't do it. And I know I'm a doctor, and if it was my patient, I'd say, don't do it. But I'm a doctor, and I'm saying, I want to get on that camel. And so he did, and did very wonderfully. And there was no negative side effect. I think that the more simple approach to health and medical issues, as a general rule of thumb, I think is much better than the over-treatment of all things.
From what I've read about the Tibetan medical system in the Gyushi, one of the categories of causes of illness, there are several different categories of causes of illness, and one of them is negative spirits, negative influence by negative spirits and so on. It seems like that's would be involved in the Mongolian shamanistic approach to dealing with illness. Do the Mongolian shamans function also as healers, with bone setting, preparing herbal concoctions and so on? And is there a role in their way of looking at things for the influence of, say, negative spirits or disturbed local spirits that can cause problems if you don't, move the wrong rock or something like this?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, with Mongolian shamanism, because Buddhism became the national religion of Mongolia under Kublai Khan in maybe, 1230 or 1240, something like that. So many, many hundreds of years. And in fact, Mongolia had Buddhism before Tibet did, because in the early days with King Ashoka, it came up through Pakistan and Kashmir and came over to the Silk Road and traveled east along north of Tibet. So Mongolians claim that Buddhism came to their country in the time of King Ashoka. And in fact, the famous translator translating many of the Prajnaparamita texts into Chinese, who the Chinese, one of the Chinese kings actually sent an army up to kidnap him, bring him down, because in those days, academics were considered national treasures, right? What was his name? Was it Kamajiva or Dharmajiva, something like, I don't remember his name offhand, but he translated, but his mother was Mongolian, and his father was Kashmir, and he's living up in one of the Mongolian republics to the northwest, and they set up. So from those early days, Mongolians had a lot of Buddhism in it. So it's hard to say who borrows from whom and what from what. But as you say, in the Tibetan world, Tibetan Medical Center says that all of our illnesses, accidents, and unhappinesses are based in one of four roots, a tree with four roots. And some of them come from anger, and anger sort of puts out a poison that creates a disbalance in the humors, the lung tipa pagan. And that can result in a disease, and it also disturbs our energy, so we can get hit by a truck. You're walking along the street thinking, that damn Steve James, I'd like to punch him in the nose, and you step off the car, bam, splat. Or attachment, desire, clinging. And, I think that's much more like craving is the meaning, a feeling of I need. It takes your mind off what you're doing and sort of lets a poison flow into the blood, which creates a whole disbalance, outer and inner and secret level. Then the third, ignorance, really means a kind of a mental fluffiness, perhaps. Either the self-grasping ignorance, as it's often called in Buddhism, Ngarzin Marikpa, incorrect understanding of the nature of the self. In other words, the relationship between self and world, the relationship between subject-object in the perceptual process. And that creates a wrong tuning, like a guitar with the strings out of tune. And that releases negative energy into the whole process, and it can create diseases or accidents or any kind of social or romantic disasters and economic disasters in life and so forth. Mishandling of life energies. And then the fourth of them is to do with spiritual energies. And so we can say a kind of a negative relationship with the spirit world, the invisible world. So sometimes people translate that as demons or demonic, but I don't like those kind of terms, because in Christianity, they sort of made this dualistic system of, angels and demons, angels and devils. Whereas in Buddhism, all living beings are, gods and ghosts are equally living beings, and they're equally objects of compassion and love and respect as all other living beings. So going out of harmony or out of whack with them is not their fault. It's partly to do with us not embracing those levels of the unseen world with compassion, with love, with openness, with spaciousness. And for instance, the further east in Asia you go, the more they're concerned with ghosts, because they have ancestral worship, and they know most of their ancestors were assholes. So probably after death ended up getting stuck here or there in the Bardo. So there's a lot of fear of ghosts, because they're kind of disturbed beings who, like, sort of angry, deadly pirates who got stuck as ghosts. Their piracy ways and their anger is still there. In the Buddhist world, we try to think of them as, well, that's just Uncle James, and he was a bit of a ruffian, and a bit of a thief, and probably a rapist and a murderer. Yeah. But deep inside, there was the Buddha nature thing. It's just slowly coming towards enlightenment. 3 steps forward, 2 back. Sometimes 3 steps forward in that particular life, 5 steps back. So to try to embrace all those things with some sort of love and compassion. So in Lojong, for instance, there's one of the precepts in the 7-point Lojong in Tibetan Buddhism that don't use the very harmful mantras on gods and ghosts when they disturb you. And try to be compassionate as you would towards some mother from some previous life who just turned out to be a wacko, a serial murderer, or whatever, but she's still your mother.
Against whom should you use those more harmful mantras then? In what circumstances would they?
So those in which, well, firstly, in Buddhism, we say only if you've done your 3-year retreat and you've gained great signs of success. And so you're not doing it against anger for the person or fear of the person, but rather as a kind of a last resort to lift them up and above what they're going through. And so we don't use the word killing in that sense. I use, as you know, the word drowa, liberating. So say, for instance, you had a brother who you knew was a serial killer, and he had taken over a school and had 100 hostages and was murdering them one by one. And you were the only sniper in the area, and you had the chance to take him out. Now, you love your brother. You don't love the fact that he's a serial murderer, that he's murdering these kids one by one until he gets his airplane full of loot and can fly to Venezuela, where he'll need the airplane full of loot. But you may, as a sniper, take him out. You're not doing it out of anger for him, nor out of fear for him, nor even to protect those other kids, although that's a factor. You're doing it because it's no good for him to murder those 100 other kids. So in those cases, one can use the wrathful methods. But Tantric texts say, unless you've done that, they don't say 3-year retreat, unless you've done the Nyenchen, the big retreat, the great retreat. Best not to do, but consider yourself unqualified to do. And the other is only on the basis of great compassion, not only great compassion for the victims of the person, but the great compassion for that being, that what they're doing isn't benefiting them, is very harmful to them. And of course, all kinds of ethical questions come up around that, like, well, is it really murder? And who decides if it's right or wrong, and all this sort of stuff. In Buddhism, we always leave it up to the person. You can't phone up the Dalai Lama and say, hey, my brother's doing this. Can I take I got a clear shot of him. Is that okay? And he's not going to say, okay, go ahead. We don't, everyone, you lays your money and you make your bets, and whatever comes out, that's it. So we're supposed to be self-monitoring and self-deciding in those effects. So I think in the shaman tradition, of course, they do kind of, it's like many of those spiritual traditions of the world, we can use our position for good, and we can use our strengths, our powers, our talents for good, or we can use them for evil. And same in the medical profession. Doctors can use their healing powers for good, or they can use them for evil. You British people should be very proud, because you hold the Guinness Book of Records for the greatest serial killer in recorded human history. Dr. Shipham, is it? You had this doctor who was, they think he murdered as many as 350 people. They're not sure how many. The modest efforts say minimum 150. But he would go to the houses of these little old folks and sit them up and say, yes, ma'am, you need your injection of blah, blah, blah. And then he would inject them with morphine or something that would, then he'd leave, and then their daughter or niece would visit in the afternoon and phone up and say, Dr. Shipman, my aunt seems to be dead. Could you come over? And he'd come over and say, oh, yes. Oh, unfortunately, yes, she died of natural causes. So wonderful. She died sitting up in her living room. So, a doctor can use his talents and powers for, politicians can do it, kings can do it, barons have done it and used it. We've had very good barons who have taken very good care of their communities, and we've had bad ones who have abused it. Celebrities, of course, in the same way, and athletes who have used their athletic power to, be wife beaters or husband beaters or whatever. And the same in the spiritual world. We've had Christian priests who have been excellent human beings. Thomas Merton is often held up as an example, a brilliant man and beautiful writer and fabulously ethical man. And we've had, pedophilic child abusers who, don't really get a passing grade on the moral score. So similarly, in the shaman world, some shamans will learn enough about the shamanistic energies to just use it for whatever they're asked to do, sort of like gun for hire. Rather than being a good cop, you could be, a harmful cop. And I think it's the same voodoo in Africa. You had healers and medicine men who were just fully dedicated to the good. But you had some who achieved some sort of low levels of powers without the spiritual insight, perhaps, who sometimes would use these things in a negative way. So I think that's always an issue, whatever we learn, right? It's like a car. If you buy a car and start driving, your chances of being involved in a car accident automatically go up. But all the shamans I met in Mongolia were all very, very well intended. I had the good luck that a French organization offered me a grant to oversee the creation of a book on shamanism by a Mongolian shaman, rather than an academic book. There's quite a few books out there by people doing PhDs in anthropology or various East Asia studies or spiritual studies that look at it in a kind of academic way. But and so I approached Byampadorj, the great shaman, and he's a prolific writer. He loves writing, and he's published 6 or 8 books, and a lot of them are just the songs of invocation. They use them as teaching things for his students, and then some of them are personal memoirs about his uncles and aunts and his legacy of relatives and their history. And it's kind of a mishmash, a kind of like most of his books, a combination of something very personal and then something very profoundly shamanic, you could say. So I hired a Mongolian friend of mine, Degi Sodbatter, to read through those half-dozen books, main books, and choose what she thought, because she speaks English and she speaks Russian and went to university in Korea, speaks Korean, and traveled around the West quite a bit. Has been very involved with Western people for a long time. So I asked her to go through those and choose maybe a couple of 100 pages of stuff that would work well for a Western introduction to the life and values of a shaman. And so she did, and I had a couple of editor friends, one in California and another British woman who lives in Nepal for like 30 or 40 or 50 years or something, help her as sort of making editorial choices. And then in the end, I went through and sort of re-edited it from my side and helped find a publisher for it. So it's called Reflections of a Mongolian Shaman. You can find it on Amazon. We chose to publish it in Nepal because Vajra books in Nepal, even though it sounds like a small country, Nepal, they do have good world distribution. These days, even some books published in India, like for instance, when I did my Tibetan Book of the Dead, an illustrated edition, although it was published in India, and the contract is with the Indian publisher, it simultaneously came out in Russian, German, French, Portuguese, and English, maybe one or two other languages. So some of these publishers, even though in the West, it's not like Simon & Schuster or Oxford University Press, they actually get a really good job done because they're sort of independent in their creativity on their how they manage to publish and distribute their works. So we chose them. They've done a wonderful job. But so that sort of gives a reading into how because some of these are very personal, like the death of his mom, and you sort of see the closeness of Buddhism and shamanism in ordinary households. Like, for instance, one of the stories is I was sitting at home, and even though he's a shaman, not really a Buddhist, although his name Byampadorj is a Buddhist name. Byampa means Maitreya, and Dorje is Vajra, so Maitri Vajra, you could say, would be the Sanskrit equivalent, if I'm reading it correctly. Otherwise, Byampa could be Saturday, but Saturn Vajra. But it's hard to know with all modern Sanskrit, modern Mongolia, because they took the traditional Mongolian and cast that in the Russian Cyrillic, which the Russians forced them to do in 1941 after Russia kind of took them over. Not as kept them independent, but as a satellite, much like, say, Bulgaria or something like that. And so a lot of those names aren't so clear what they would be back in the original Tibetan, but I think it means Maitri Vajra, but it might mean Saturn Vajra. So he's got a Buddhist name. He's talking about it now. He's a fully fledged shaman, one of the 10 great shamans in the Mongolian world today. He's saying, yeah, it was very wonderful when my mom passed away. We're all sitting at home, and communism had just fallen a few days before. And for the first time in our history, the Buddhist monks of the only temple, we're only allowed to have one temple in all of Mongolia. It's kind of a state showcase for visitors that we had religious freedom. So we're only allowed one. But they were never allowed to do anything on TV or anything like that, or have any kind of, they're really there as a kind of a state thing for visitors. For the first time, they were being televised, and they had the Maitreya statue. The first thing they did was, they used to have a very large standing bronze of Maitreya, the Buddha, the largest in the world. And Stalin had it shipped to Russia and melted down to make into bullets for the World War effort for his army. And so the first thing they did was rebuild that, and they're reconsecrating it. And my mama, we're all sitting there, and we're all so happy to see that finally we're getting some religious freedom back. And this is kind of a big signal to the whole country that it's true, communism now is officially gone. And my mom was sitting there, she was so happy and holding her mantra mala. And then just sitting in her chair, and we're all watching TV. And sometime later, we all look over and say, Mom, isn't that great? And we notice that she stopped doing her mantra. She just passed away while watching the consecration of the Maitreya statue. So he's sort of saying this, that even though I'm a shaman, our household was very much a blend of shamanism and Buddhism. And for his mom, that was very much the case. So yeah, doing that book was a lot of fun, being involved. And it was like a 3-year project or something like that. And I think, yeah, that's had a reasonably good distribution around the world. And, the nice thing now is Amazon is very international. So anyone anywhere in the world can get a copy.
Reflections of a Mongolian Shaman.
Right, yeah.
Very amazing. I could certainly quiz you about this for several more hours, but let me ask you this by way of wrapping it up. In some of the American shamanic traditions, I have heard it said that there are different sorts of medicine men or shamanistic figures, and sometimes I've seen it depicted as a horizontal and vertical axis. There's a sort of spiritual insight, spiritual wisdom type, and then there's the axis of power, spiritual or shamanistic power, and that there are some who are on the more power side, and there are some that are more on the spiritual insight side, and there are others who are plotted somewhere, a mix of both, perhaps. Also, I think in Chinese shamanistic ideas, sometimes it's said from the Buddhist side, get enlightened first, then develop the special shamanistic sort of supernatural powers in order to be of service and so on. I've heard that model as well. Do any of those models apply at all in the Mongolian shamanistic context?
It's hard to say what it was in the past, say what it was pre-Buddhist, but because Kublai Khan made Buddhism the national religion of all Mongols, especially of aristocrats. I mean, nothing else was banned, but your foundations had to be the Golden Light Sutra, basically. And, love, compassion, bodhicitta, the 6 paramitas, the 6 perfections. So that was there. So it's hard to say what Mongolian shamanism was before those kind of influences, just like, say, if we look at the Pueblo Indians in New Mexico today, what they were like before missionaries forced them all to put their kids in missionary schools and stuff like that, or the shamanism of Mexico or South America, where everyone grew up under a Christian world in which what they were had to be sort of clothed in the language of that. But Byampadorj in Reflections of a Mongolian Shaman, I included a chapter. So I was sort of the one who chose in the end what would be go in and not. One of them is what makes a good shaman. And there's first thing he says is love and compassion. His main intention should be to do good. So I think all shamans start like that. And but in order to do good, we should become ritualistically powerful. In other words, you can do good as a doctor or a nurse or road builder because people need good roads, or a carpenter because people need nice houses, plumber because it's nice when your toilet flushes and doesn't go all over your floor. The doing good thing is kind of a universal for every profession. And he says it's more important for shamans in some ways because you're working on a different level, so you can create a different kind of dimension and it can be a little more pronounced. But they do speak about shamans who basically, after getting a little bit of power with shamanic channeling and ritual sides, do sort of become, guns for hire more than looking at the good. I discussed this with one of my other favorite shamans. He said, well, it's difficult to be judgmental about these things because what's good for one person is not necessarily good for another. And sometimes what is good has to be a little bit bad for someone. For instance, if we take, something like global warming and the use of fossil fuels, in that 90% of the world's energy today is run by fossil fuels. That's good for some 90% of the people, bad for global warming, perhaps. And to make a change, or it's like, I don't know, when a factory was making buggy whips for when your taxis were horses and buggies, and the one making buggy whips was very good. And then the people who decided to buy up those companies and end the buggy whip industry and convert it into making seats for cars. It was bad for those peoples whose lives were invested in making buggy whips, but it was good for what would be more practical in the future. So sometimes, that shaman was saying, sometimes there is a conflict of good in terms of what's good for one may not be good for the other. Of course, it's always wonderful if it's good for both, but it's not. For instance, in Mongolia, one of the politicians came to me and read about me in the newspaper and said, oh yeah, Lama Glen's supposed to be really powerful at Buddhist Tantric ritual. If I go and ask him to do a ritual to help me win the election, then blah, 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 it'll probably help. I had no idea what party he belonged to, if he was a good guy or a bad guy. And he came and I said, well, I'm sorry, I don't do that sort of thing. You can, there might be someone else around who would do it. Later, he came back and he scolded me. I only lost by 40 votes. Your vote, your endorsement would have gotten me those 40 votes. I think he was more interested in the newspaper endorsement than in the ritual. But anyway, if one were a shaman and one could do a ritual to influence, then the one who wins, obviously, it's good for him. And the one who loses, not so good for him from the perspective of winning that particular election. Who's to say over a period of the next 500 years, which one would have been best, right? So I think that was the shaman's point, is that we tend to judge good and evil or good and bad on very particular criterions. But there are certainly some shamans who become more interested in the money side of it, same as there are doctors who become more involved in the money side, or auto mechanics, or in your case, I think, boat heating units might become more interested in the money side than in other aspects of it, and then in pure service, you could say. I think in any profession, it's difficult not to mix in personal greed, personal pride, egoism, and those kind of negative personality traits, if you will. It doesn't matter what it is. So that would certainly be the case also in shamanism. Some people often use it for love potions. I want to be able to date, blah, 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 blah. And if I go to a shaman, that'll give me the edge. And, I've had friends in Mongolia who boasted of doing that sort of thing. No, I don't know if that's good or bad. I mean, a little bit of love powder is perhaps or love smoke in the atmosphere is perhaps not such a bad thing, but, it's kind of a questionable use of such talents, unless it's motivated on more than just sort of personal conquest, personal pleasure, personal success. So I'm sure every shaman sort of has that kind of issue with any person who he or she agrees to accept as a patron or client or whatever you want to call them. And there are always those two sides to everything in every profession, the spiritual side, and you could say the power or ethical side. And I think in Buddhism, from the beginning, there's great emphasis on bodhicitta, love, compassion. So then regardless of what other good things come out, you'll always use it in a loving, kind way. Now, loving and kind are only limited to your understanding and your choices, right? Often there's, like on the Titanic, you've got so many lifeboats and so many people, and who should you put on? It's a personal choice. And the ones who got on were obviously very happy that the choice was made the way it was. The ones who did not get on were not so happy with those criteria. And I think, I would have to say from my side, I've never met a shaman who I thought had questionable motivation or was especially selfish or self-serving or in any way looked upon the darker side of whatever is one's skill and one's talent, using that in a negative way or self-serving way. I would say all the ones I met, and perhaps it's because after communism, Mongolia became a kind of an idealistic state. If you oppress something for 65 or 75 years, and then you lift the lid off, everyone tends to be very positive. So, but yeah, I think, those two sides are there in every person, even with a husband, wife, kids. We have to be a little careful that what we're doing is also good for them as well as good for us. And that as a parent, we have a lot of power. We also have some kind of spiritual sense or sensitivity. That same sort of situation is there.
And Mullin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Always a joy, always a pleasure, and an honor. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.